Welcome back to Lydia McGrew channel and to my ongoing series on editorial fatigue. Today I'm going to be talking about the parable of the minas, or pounds as it's sometimes translated, in Luke. It's found in Luke 19, 11 through 27. I won't be reading the whole thing in the interests of time. The comparison of this parable to the parable of the talents given in Matthew 25, 14 through 30 is a fairly popular example of Goodacre's theory of editorial fatigue in what's called double tradition material. That is, material that's somewhat similar between, or even very similar between, Matthew and Luke, sometimes attributed to Q. It is therefore part of his case against Q, but that does not mean that he's holding that the parable of the minas is historical. On the contrary, he's saying that it is a non-historical adaptation that the author of Luke made, working directly from Matthew. So it is important to understand that this is a fact-changing claim. It gives an air of rigor to it, as you'll see the number of arguments that he tries to bring here, that this is Luke's invention of a new parable based only upon Matthew. So that's why I'm going to actually be taking two videos to talk about his arguments on this, so that neither one of them gets too long. So if you haven't reread those in a while and you're interested in following this, it might be a good idea to go read the parable of the talents in Matthew 25 and the parable of the minas in Luke 19. They're really quite different, even though they have some language that is very similar as well. But there are some big differences. For example, the amounts of money are vastly different. D.A. Carson, in his commentary on Matthew, is also addressing this question because it has to do with the relationship of Matthew and Luke. He emphasizes that it can be hard to estimate how much a talent was worth, but since it looks like it was a silver talent in Matthew's version, he takes a certain rate of pay and then compares them by how long you'd have to work to earn a silver talent and how long you'd have to work at that same rate of pay to earn a mina. And so it's 3 months to earn a mina at a denarius a day, approximately, and then approximately 20 years to earn a single silver talent at the same rate. So, and then some of the people in Matthew's parable of the talents, they receive even more than just one talent. So obviously much greater amounts of money in Matthew. Another big difference is that the servants all receive the same amount. In Luke, this rather modest amount of money, each servant receives the same, whereas in Matthew it emphasizes that the 3 different servants receive different amounts to begin with from their master who's about to go away, according to their abilities. Now, what's common to both of them is that the master goes away and then he comes back and he praises those who have done business with what he gave them and earned more money by it. They've multiplied the investment, as it were, and he really criticizes the one and even, casts him into outer darkness in Matthew, who didn't do anything with it, who just, hid it in a napkin or dug in the earth and hid it. So there are similarities. The time period also appears to be different. I'll be talking a little bit more about that when I talk about what is characteristic or not characteristic in Luke. But Luke is pretty definite that it took place when they were on their way to Jerusalem, and in this case it would be for that last time. And some of the people thought that the kingdom of God was going to happen, immediately, that this eschatological thing was just going to come. And so then Jesus told this parable because that was what they were thinking. And since the parable involves the nobleman going away to receive a kingdom, it's a warning that he's going to go away, that the earthly kingdom isn't going to come right away. That's another difference between the two. In the parable of the Minas, there's this whole element in the story. The nobleman is going away to receive a kingdom, and the people in that prospective kingdom send a delegation and say, no, we don't want you to rule over us. We don't want you to be our king. And then it comes back to that at the end, that he wants them to be executed. You know, he receives the kingdom anyway, even though they didn't want him to be their king. And that element is just not there in the parable of the talents in Matthew. Now, there is some very similar wording. There are very similar aspects to the stories, but there's also the, you have been faithful over a little, I will make you a ruler over much. You've been faithful in a few things, I will make you ruler over many, and so forth. So that's similar too. But as Carson emphasizes, this does not lie beyond what is expected in a teacher who gives similar illustrations on different occasions. Notice this is a parable. This is teaching material. This is not like a dialogue in some actual incident in the story. So if you have identical wording in an identical dialogue with people, then that seems like it's being portrayed as the same incident. But if you have very similar wording between two somewhat different parables that look on the face of it like different parables, that can just be because the teachers were using similar material. I've had that happen to me. I'll reuse an illustration, especially for an illustration, and then I'll say, I think I'm going to, I'll think in my mind, I'm going to substitute that. Instead of making it this kind of a hat, I have an illustration about a hat. Instead of making it a policeman's hat, I'm going to make it an electrical lineman's hat or something like that. But it's essentially the same illustration in its kind of broad outline. So that's not improbable at all. Goodacre, on the other hand, is arguing that Jesus did not tell two different parables. At the most, and he doesn't even really get into the historicity of it, but at the most, he told the one that's found in Matthew, the parable of the talents, and Luke came along and tried to invent something to make it look like a different second parable told by Jesus, like it's a different parable, but that Luke isn't very good at it. That's Goodacre's position. And Luke, according to him, does these awkward things, these sort of bumbling things, and that gives away the fact that he's composing it based upon Matthew, and then this supposed editorial fatigue sets in as he continues over what is really quite a small number of verses. So I'm going to summarize the highlights of Goodacre's arguments, and then I'm going to start getting into them in a little more detail and complete that next time. One of the biggest aspects is that in Luke's story, there are 10 servants at the beginning, and they each get 1 mina or pound. But then Luke only actually goes into detail about what happens with 3 of them. So 7 of them just kind of drop off the radar. Goodacre considers this to be very awkward, obviously a blunder. Luke just kind of forgot that he had mentioned 10 and then doesn't do anything with the rest of them, and supposedly falls back into the 3 servants that we find in Matthew. Moreover, as we'll be emphasizing, talking about in more detail today, supposedly Luke likes 10 versus 1 oppositions. All right. And so the introduction of 10 is supposed to be especially typical of Luke, which is supposed to be sort of a giveaway that he's inventing this non-historically. And then later on, when the nobleman says to take the pound away from the one who didn't increase it and give it to the servant that increased it the most, he says, give it to the servant who has 10 minas, and the other servants sort of object, and they say, well, he already has 10 minas. This is supposed to be bad math. This is the bad math argument, because when that servant increases his lord's small starting capital, it's worded as it made 10 more. And that's the most popular translation. I might get into this a little bit next time. Some people have argued it could be translated as it is increased to 10. But if it made 10 more in addition to the original one, why, then he has 11. And so it's supposed to be this bad math on the part of Luke, which presumably would be bad math on the part of Jesus if it were historical, to say he has 10, or give it to the one who has 10 because it should be given to the one who has 11. So those, in summary, are Goodacre's arguments for editorial fatigue. Today I'm going to start with the one about 10 being a typical Lucan number, and specifically 10 total, and then one of those having some special feature. Why is typicalness an argument? Well, Goodacre sometimes tries to bring this up because his idea is that when you are going to have editorial fatigue, at the very beginning of the section, the pericope, the derivative author will introduce something that is typical, quote unquote, or characteristic of the derivative author's own preferences, inventions, etc. And you can note that, oh, that's characteristic, but then as he continues, he lapses into something that is either not particularly characteristic of his own work, or even occasionally, Goodacre will claim, especially characteristic of his alleged source. And then this characteristic beginning, non-characteristic or less characteristic continuation is supposed to be a sign of editorial fatigue. So what about this claim that Luke likes tens and then 1? If you go to Goodacre's textbook, which is the synoptic problem A Way Through the Maze, and it's pretty clearly intended as a textbook, he says to the reader that Luke likes, he calls it the ratio of 10 to 1. It's really a ratio of 9 to 1, but never mind, or the proportion of 10 to 1. What he really means is something like in the parable found only in Luke of the woman who had 10 coins and one is lost. And he gives that example. 10 coins, one of the coins is lost. He also gives the example of 10 lepers and only one is thankful. That is, of course, not a parable. That is an incident told in Luke. And I find it noteworthy that Goodacre doesn't seem to feel there's any additional burden of proof taken on by the implication that Luke simply invented the 10 and the 1 in the case of the lepers in an actual miracle of Jesus, or what he portrays as an actual miracle. Or are we to think that, he invented the whole miracle, or he had no idea how many lepers there were, and he just said, hey, I'll make it 10 and only one is thankful, or what? But it's that kind of completely casual assumption of invention by Luke is very typical of Goodacre, as of mainstream scholars generally, and it's something that needs to be brought out because they never recognize the burden of proof that they're taking on, or virtually never, in explicit terms. Like, you can't just assume that Luke just made stuff up like that. But then this is supposed to be an independent argument that Luke made stuff up because of this fondness that he has for, 10 total, and then one of them had this characteristic. Now, in the textbook, he gives those two examples, the coins and the lepers, and then he goes, and so forth. But actually, you can find a concordance, look for every use of the word 10 anywhere in Luke or in Acts. You will not find a single other instance. There is no and so forth, okay? The third alleged instance is supposed to be this very parable. the instance in question, okay? So Goodacre gives the impression that there's this large number of cases in uniquely Lucan material where he has 10 total and one of them has a particular characteristic, and there's actually only the 2 that he mentions. The one as stated, as he gives it in the textbook, isn't even of the same kind as the 10 coins and 1 is lost, because as stated in the textbook, it's 10 servants and they're each given 1 mina. So it's not even entities of the same kind. Now, in one of his other discussions of this, he shifts that a little. It's 10 servants and 1 is unprofitable. So the one who doesn't increase his master's capital investment, that's the 1. So now we at least have entities of the same kind. But in that case, what about the 2 who are profitable? Now we've got 10 total servants and 2 who are profitable. So this isn't that exciting of an example of this supposed tendency on Luke's part either. But it gets better. He actually has a monograph on the work of the liberal scholar Goodacre, and there he actually admits that there are other problems with this, and he states it much more cautiously. The thesis from Goodacre that he's borrowing from is a thesis that has this big sort of disjunction. Supposedly, Luke is fond of the number 10, the number 5, multiples of the number 10, multiples of the number 5, and 10s compared to 1s. So now we've got so many things in here that we can make it look like a bigger quote-unquote pattern, but we've had to loosen up the criteria to where we're including all kinds of other things. In this more cautious monograph, Goodacre actually admits that there are 5s and 10s in Matthew as well. So like the 10 virgins and 5 are wise and 5 are foolish. There are other examples in Luke of unique numbers like the 2 sons and 1 is a prodigal son, right? Or 100 sheep and 1 of them is lost, so that's 101, not 10 and 1, and so forth. So he actually says something like it's possible but not probative that these instances are Luke's creations without an independent source. And he even says that it will depend upon whether you already think that in the case of Matthew, Luke is borrowing directly from Matthew or not. Okay, so if you already believe that Luke is just modifying Matthew, instead of having separate information, you will find these compelling where Luke has added numbers to Matthew, or in this case, greatly modified, quote unquote, that's his theory, the parable, and made up a totally different parable in Matthew that it starts with 10 servants. That's because you already think this. But what's interesting is that that monograph was the earliest of the 3 writings I've covered. There's the monograph, then there's the synoptic issue, the paper on the synoptic problem, and then there's the textbook. That's the latest one. And he's much less cautious in the paper, and especially much less cautious in the textbook. There, he's using it as an argument that this is borrowed directly from Matthew, and then that Luke made up the 10 servants because he likes the number 10. So we've gone from, well, if you already think it, then you will think that that's what's going on, to, well, this is evidence that that's what's going on, that Luke is just making up this extra number of servants because he's making up a parable that Jesus never told. Well, you know, which is it? Because otherwise it's just circular, all right? Well, why should we be confident that Luke didn't have another source for this parable that introduces 10 servants? Well, because we already think that Luke was only working with Matthew. But then why should we think that Luke is only working with Matthew and trying to make up its own parable and doing it in a kind of a klutzy way? Well, because we know that in the material that he invents tens and fives. So since this has a 10 in it, and that's unique to Luke's parable, that's a clue, because it's a typical beginning, that Luke is inventing this parable. You can't do it that way. That's not right. There's another aspect to this, which is the definition of typical, and at what point in the parable we start saying this is the beginning, and we're going to look to see if this begins in a typical way. In other cases where it's maybe a miracle or a parable, Goodacre will apply his concept of what is typical for the derivative author to the setting. But here he's applying his idea is as to what is typical to the actual start of the parable rather than to the setting. Why does that matter? Well, here's why that matters. If you just back up a verse to the setting, you actually find something that's a little non-typical of Luke. And the scholar John Wenham has pointed this out. Luke does a lot of what I've called achronological narration, where he'll just say, and he said to his disciples, or as the crowds were increasing, he said, or something like that. No clear temporal setting, especially in this large section known as the central section of Luke. And we're just sort of coming out of that central section here. But it's very firm. Okay, as I mentioned earlier in this video, Luke actually says they're going to Jerusalem, and some of the people think that the kingdom is about to return immediately. It's about to be revealed immediately. And so then Jesus tells this parable to correct that idea. This is uncharacteristically specific for Luke. But that doesn't fit with Goodacre's idea, because Goodacre will say that it's at the beginning that the author is doing something that's more characteristic, something that's more typical, and then lapsing away from that as he engages in what he calls docile reproduction as he goes on and suffers allegedly from editorial fatigue. So I would challenge that claim. So we've got this questionable claim that the 10 servants are somehow a giveaway because Luke likes 10s, and when Luke has a 10 that nobody else has, that means Luke's making it up. But it's also questionable to say that it begins in a characteristic way, because if you just back up to the setting, it actually begins in a rather uncharacteristic way. So what you see here is this sort of amorphous nature of the evidence that redactive critics work with. And they are not usually sufficiently self-aware of that and of the fact that they're cherry picking, or to use a different metaphor, they're out walking in the woods and they think they see a path, but it's actually an illusion. There is no real path. That's just how the trees happen to grow. And you get a lot of that here. And I think you can see that in what we've discussed right here. So next time, I'm going to be talking about the remainder of his arguments that Luke suffers from editorial fatigue in the parable of the Minas, and therefore that the parable of the Minas was made up. So please come back next time to the Lydia Magruder channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.